Okay, well, we'll get started. I just want to say it's nice to see you all. I hope you're all keeping well, that your friends and families are keeping healthy and well. And I'm grateful to you for joining us for this conversation today. I wanted to thank Stephen Mim as well for connecting the history department. Greetings, how are you? To the Willson Center for our spring series in Global Georgia. It's getting really busy over the next couple of weeks. So we have today's wonderful conversation. And Carole, you're very welcome virtually to Athens, University of Georgia. Thank you for taking the time to be with us to talk about your book. And there are several events coming up this week, and I really wanted just to share with you on Thursday evening, especially there's a conversation with our colleague Ed Pavlich in the English department about a record that he's created with Athenian hip hop artists, which are connected to some of our Mellon funded projects. So that'll be on Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. But I'm just delighted to see you all here. I'm glad you're all keeping healthy and well. I hope that your research is going well, Bryant, and other graduate students in the history department. I do run the Willson Center, so if I can help you in any way, and I have been thinking of you, Brand, and your suggestions, but if I can help you in any way, please don't be shy to reach out to me. So without any further ado, Stephen.
Yes, thank you, Nicholas. I want to thank everyone for being here, if virtually, and especially thank the Willson Center for helping make this possible. I've known Carole, I believe, for about close to a decade, I guess. Is that about right?
Probably getting there, yeah.
And as you know, if you've here, you know that we'll be talking and having a dialogue or conversation based on the book that she wrote, based on her dissertation, Beyond Redemption. And this is a book that examines the role of violence in the era immediately after the Civil War in the postbellum South. Carole is currently working on a new project, which I believe you've got a tentative title, A Folk History of Freedom. Is that still correct?
It is going to be called, I believe, I haven't heard otherwise from the press, The Long Emancipation of Priscilla Joyner, Searching for Freedom After the Civil War. So it actually, I'm just finishing it up. It should be out next March.
Wow. Congratulations.
Thank
So
you.
she will have crossed that critical second book divide, which every academic dreads and looks forward to. So without further ado, Carole, I was hoping that we could begin by you talking a bit about what brought you to the first book, and then we'll be having a kind of freewheeling conversation that I hope will connect past and present insofar as the patterns of violence that you describe in your first book, how they perhaps are still unfortunately alive and well in our 21st century America.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks, Stephen, for inviting me back to Georgia. I've been there before in person, which is a wonderful thing. But I'm happy to be with you virtually as well. And thanks to Nicholas and Dave for hosting our little event here. So as Stephen mentioned, I began the book that became Beyond Redemption as a dissertation project. And I was actually thinking that it was about 20 years ago this year, about 2001, because I was getting ready to do my defense when 9/11 happened. So I was writing up my dissertation proposal. That day, actually, I was doing a TA training. But so, and I say that because it was it did change and help me sort of solidify the questions I was interested in. In particular, I became very, very interested in what it was like to live in circumstances in which you were afraid, right? When fear became sort of one of the defining factors in your sort of cultural and social world. And for free people, former slaves in the post-Civil War period, I mean, fear, you could argue for us in the 9/11 period that fear was sort of largely exaggerated in some ways, and sort of something that politicians used, right, to galvanize the population in a particular sort of warlike footing. But it was certainly very real and very palpable and very consequential for freed people in the post-emancipation period, because of course, as we all know, they faced incredible violence, small scale sort of acts of everyday violence, which white Southerners could commit with, relative impunity, except for short periods in various places where the Freedmen's Bureau was particularly active and particularly sympathetic to the plight of freedmen, and attempted to sort of mediate those relationships and prosecute whites who had committed acts of violence against Black people. And then, of course, there was a period there in the late 1860s and early 1870s when the federal government was particularly interested in prosecuting violence that they deemed to be interfering with the political process. And so you have President Grant and the Enforcement Acts in 1871 and 1872, which led to, extensive investigations in places like South Carolina and Mississippi, where they term these groups all to be the Ku Klux Klan, but there were a variety of different kind of white paramilitary organizations that were active in committing violence, and in particular voter intimidation. That was really what the federal government was interested in the 1870s, was voter intimidation, violence that was trying to inhibit African Americans' right to the franchise. So it was in that milieu of the sort of post 9/11 world where, you think about fear, the fear of fear, and the effects that living sort of in a constant state of war or war preparedness. I was thinking about the effects that was having on the society in which I was living, and the way, my expectations of the government were shifting, and sort of imagining how that also shaped freed people and their expectations of the government and the claims that they made on the government as well. So that was the atmosphere in which I was sort of formulating my ideas and beginning to carry out the research. And then, of course, bringing that up to today, it was only a few weeks ago that we had, what was basically a white paramilitary assault on the nation's Capitol building. And I will be honest, I haven't completely thought it through. I actually, on the day that it was happening, I found it too painful to watch. And so I've been slow to sort of process and think about what that meant, and the tie-ins to my own work in the 1860s and 1870s. I've read some wonderful things by people. Judy Giesberg wrote something in the Washington Post a few weeks ago about the Enforcement Acts and Grant's legacy as president. As sort of, as his, really sort of unacknowledged, efforts to curb Southern violence and protect freed people. I was, asked, for comment on various things from the press, and I'll be honest, I ignored the emails because I didn't know what to say. So this is really my first public attempt to try to make sense of what has been happening recently, and how it relates to this really, very long history of white violence, and the sense that at moments when the electorate seems to be moving towards what we would think of as a more sort of democratic electorate, that and moving towards more progressive type policies, that there seems to be this backlash, often a violent backlash, from the right, that attempts to sort of delegitimize those moves in a number of ways. So that was certainly at work when I was writing Beyond Redemption, when I was looking at the 1860s and the 1870s and the post-emancipation South, and it has reared its ugly head yet again. So I'm interested to hearing your questions and your thoughts, and we can talk through some of this, and you can help me sort of work through how this is currently playing out in our government and in our society. So I'm interested to hear, what you think and what questions you have as well.
Well, I'd invite questions from me. I had one just observation, Carole, just since you mentioned that kind of 20-year context. I appreciate that this is in one way a very American narrative, but I wonder what transnational perspectives might add to the conversation, both in the past and in the present, about this relationship of state violence, voter intimidation, those kinds of issues.
The one thing that's certainly the conclusion that I came to writing Beyond Redemption Right is the whole, and I sort of try to wrap that up towards the end of the book, this idea about American exceptionalism. America in terms of these kinds of issues, political violence, intimidation, the sort of skinniness of its electoral history. We like to often, sort of look askance at other countries and criticize them for the way in which they handle these issues, when in fact it is, something that is as problematic and as troubling in this country as it is everywhere else. And I saw a few weeks ago, I can't remember who exactly, saying, so, this is what happens in banana republics. This isn't what happens, in the United States. I'm like, are you kidding? Right? Because this happens here. It happens recently. It's happened, sort of in the longer past. So I think you're absolutely right. I think when you broaden things out and you look at those larger global histories, America has, so much more in common than I think American historians realize, and that the general public likes to admit, with places with what we consider to be undemocratic traditions.
Thank you. So guys, you can put, and I mean guys in the Irish sense of everyone, questions in the chat, or if you'd like to just call up, since we're all now co-panelists, and we have many great scholars here of the American past. Scott?
Yeah, thanks so much, Carole. I've loved your book for a really long time, and I've taught it. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about your ideas about civic theology that you start the book with. You kind of make these, you go in this direction, certainly initially, of kind of conceptualizing this violence as a kind of, redemptive in the sense that a lot of, that is not unfamiliar, I guess, to some scholars of Southern religion, right? They've mm-hmm. kind of used like lynching as a kind of theological trope and things like that. But would you be willing to talk about that, and maybe even think about whether that kind of civic theology is still there, right? That there's some kind of guilt or something like that that's attempted, there's atonement that's kind of being looked for somewhere.
Yeah, I definitely think the work of lynching scholars was very formative for me in sort of thinking that through, because I definitely saw in the sources, especially when you sort of dig into those sort of white supremacist newspapers and the personal writings of some of the key players in those movements in South Carolina and Louisiana, you see this sort of like, purification, blood purification, almost a blood sacrifice kind of vision for what they thought they were doing, right? And they thought, the spilling of blood was not just something like, a sort of unfortunate, occurrence, but it was something that they actually thought would sort of purify the electorate. I mean, that's really sort of what some of them imagined that they were doing. So that blending of that kind of theological imagery with their own sort of political ideology, I think was really powerful. I didn't look so much in the books. I didn't really look at, at sermons or anything like that. I know Luke Harlow has done some of that work. and Stephanie McCurry looked at it in the the antebellum period with, ideas about mastery and secession and things like that. But I think that was, it's a really powerful way, that they processed it themselves, that they made room for the violence in their own minds, but it was also a way to justify and legitimize that. And put out that call to the people that they were actually going to need to carry it out. So I do think it was helpful, in that way, and useful to blend those two things together. I'll admit that, probably one of the shortcomings of the book is that I don't delve into religion, in a great deal. And it's one of my shortcomings as a scholar, and has a lot to do with my own sort of anti-religious predilections. But it is, I think, a really sort of important way that violence was, I guess, filtered or siphoned, sort of throughout the population, and that sort of allows people a certain level of comfort with it.
Well, thanks very much.
Right.
So I'm still trying to figure out how to kind of frame this question. First, I want to say thank you for joining us today. I was actually first introduced to your book and Dr. Nesbit's a split level course on Reconstruction several years ago. And so one of the things that I think a lot about with your book is how you talk about the centrality of violence, but the kind of the idea of suffering and struggle as kind of being foundational to understandings of freedom and liberty and stuff like that, and how in a way it kind of creates this circularity of violence, and both sides or this that I think kind of plays into January 6th, and just, I mean, a lot of stuff prior to that and since, is this idea that like conservatives or white supremacists or whatever are somehow being victimized, and that their claim to kind of acting in certain ways is because of their perceived victimization. And then when it kind of there's some kind of punishment or holding them accountable, will push the conversation of whether or not they're actually being held accountable down the road. But that kind of justifies more claims of being kind of persecuted or something like that. And it seems almost, I'm not trying to say that this is a comparable thing, but it does seem kind of like a flip side of the Black men in your book, kind of how they had to form these companies to go to the polls to basically preserve their rights and their ability to vote. But that was kind of misinterpreted or mispresented or used as a justification for violence against African Americans or further violence. So I guess just this idea, or I guess I'm asking you to elaborate on how you kind of see, or what problems you see from this idea of viewing struggle and stuff as kind of foundational to our understanding of freedom, and how it kind of creates this circularity of violence.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're getting at is sort of the idea that I was dealing with in the book, that about who legitimately gets to wield violence, right? Who can legitimately claim, right, that they are enacting certain kinds of violence. for white men, it was them, right? And so when African American Black men were, it really began during the war when they're initiated into the military service, right? That's sort of what sets off this longer backlash, is the idea that Black men could be ensconced with that kind of state power, right? That they can fight and kill for the state, right? On behalf of the nation. That really sort of, is too much. And, when they're organized, when they're part, of militias in the South, and many of them are parts of actual state militias. Louisiana is a great example. South Carolina is another one, right? When they're law enforcement officers, right? When they hold positions of sheriff or deputy or some of these more sort of law enforcement type positions, that is just anathema to white Southern men who think that they're the one, they can't possibly, right, embody sort of state authority and state violence in that way. And I was actually watching on, I guess it was Good Morning America, and it was also on the ABC Nightly News last night. They did an interview with one of the Black Capitol Hill policemen who was there a couple of weeks ago on January 6th. Not the one who's gotten sort of all the accolades, but one of the sort of unsung guys. And he was talking about, this crowd was coming at him and they were calling him the N-word and all of these horrible things. And they're carrying one of the Blue Lives Matter flags, with the line. And he said, and he sort of pointed it out to them, had this moment of sort of dialogue with one of these guys. He's like, you're calling me this, you're attacking me, and you're carrying a Blue Lives Matter flag. And he said the guy sort of stopped for a minute, had this moment of like cognitive dissonance, right? Where he's like, oh, yeah. And then he said, no, I'm doing this for you. Right. So he sort of spins it around and he said, I'm doing this for you, right? Even though you're the policeman, you're the person who's been given, the policing powers, I'm doing it for you, right? I'm taking back the government for you. And, so these are the kind of, it doesn't make complete sense, but these are the kind of calculations that the white people in my book, and it seems that the white people today are making to try to justify and reason out in their own minds the violence that they're doing.
Thank you.
Please, Jonathan.
Thank you. Dr. Emberton, it's a pleasure to sort of come face to face with you.
Thank you.
I likewise owe Dr. Nesbit for introduction to your fine book. I want to ask if you can comment on how violence, it's sort of a two-edged sword, because violence, like you described in Reconstruction, African Americans could use violence against them to try to gain some sympathy, but there was also this element of titillation about it, how they could gain sympathy from it, but it could also make them seem, emasculated or vulnerable or not worth protecting. And in our current and dangerous time right now, there's some concern about, the violence at the Capitol, for instance. It's shocked a lot of Americans. This is not where we want to go down as a country, but it's also radicalizing some people. I'm wondering if you could comment sort of how you saw this sort of dual nature of violence play out from what you've researched.
Yeah, I mean, African Americans, there have certainly been times throughout history, Kelly Carter Jackson's book's really great about this, where African Americans wield, sort of defensive violence, on their own behalf and on behalf of their families and communities. Ada Williams talks about this in her book as well, where they, there are, these sort of stories, where they fight off the Klan successfully. And I think it's important to remember that. You know, I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine who's a Black philosopher. And, you know, he was saying, this was a while ago, but he was saying, you know, he was making an argument, and I think he was thinking about sort of writing a piece about Black arms bearing, and, you know, that this is what, you know, African Americans, you know, need to do more of. And I'm really torn because it's just never, you know, in reality, the way that functions, it doesn't work sort of across the board. So it's always worrying to me. And I think it's because I think it's really easy to slip into an easy sort of romanticization of that kind of violence, right? Of that kind of fighting back. And I understand why people do it. But, you know, I think in reality, it has had more of a negative effect on, you know, race relations and the, you know, sort of the lived experiences of people as a whole. It just makes me really wary, right? To sort of see calls for greater amounts of, you know, militant resistance or arms bearing on, you know, on behalf of disenfranchised groups. Because I think you know, it's really dangerous. You know, the work of Kathleen Belew, who is at the University of Chicago, and she's works on these white paramilitaries sort of in post-Vietnam and today. And that stuff is, to me, just immensely frightening. And I think that's one of the reasons I had the reaction that I did on January 6th. This stuff to me is immensely frightening. And I think it's easy to sort of, you know, be flippant about, you know, our responses to it. But I think it's something that the government has to think long and hard about addressing. I fully support and think, you know, the prosecution. You know, Merrick Garland said yesterday in his testimony, you know, that was going to be his #1 priority if he is confirmed as the Attorney General. And I think that is probably the best way to go, right? Is holding a way to sort of declaw these groups is through the legal system, as sort of slow and laborious as that sometimes can be. I mean, you actually see that in 1871 and 1872 in the places where the Marshal Service and the Justice Department vigorously prosecuted the Klans, those counties in South Carolina and Louisiana and Mississippi, they wiped it out. It reemerged in other forms later on when the federal enforcement was relaxed, but for a time, right, it worked. And that is the important lesson that I mentioned Judy Giesberg's piece in the Washington Post a few weeks ago. That was the really important point that she was trying to make, that federal enforcement can work, and it does work, but it has to be sustained. And, you know, from my historical perspective is that is really the best route to root out this kind of white paramilitary, white reactionary kind of violence, not greater arms bearing or among sort of the general population, which I just think is a recipe for, unfortunately, greater violence.
Thank you very much.
Do you mind my asking you, Carole, just again as an outsider really listening to these conversations, but I have an understanding of the context in other imperial situations, and just makes me think, that's I suppose I asked the transnational one, but I'm also thinking about the war, which is not just physical, but which is mental and which is propagandistic. And could you share with me, as someone who doesn't know, just what the world of communications of the 1870s was like? And in comparison, how does that make today different, or is there any similarity?
That's really interesting. There is sort of a, you know, the press, you know, as we know it today, was quite different in the 1860s and 1870s. And so you do have these sort of small newspapers, and they have, they run very briefly, for 9 months out of a year or 6 months out of a year. And, we can find, limited run, 3 issues here, 2 issues there, that kind of thing. Some of these sort of what I mentioned, these white supremacist newspapers that really do, I mean, you could make the sort of comparison to a, parlay, these platforms, QAnon. I mean, some of the things that they talk about and the sort of conspiracy theories about sort of what is happening, not only in their local community, what Black people are up to, but who's putting them up to it, all the way up to, to Grant and, and the folks in Washington and what is going on. I mean, it really is that sort of level of what we would probably call, in our more unguarded moments, just nutty. There's just nutty stuff being said. Rumors being circulated about, white people being murdered and women being raped. There aren't pedophile rings in pizza parlors, but there are those kinds of, rumors of violence that Black people are committing, which of course there's no evidence for, but it just, right, it keeps repeating. And these little rag newspapers are often just reprinting something that they saw in another paper, right? So it gets, in some ways, it sort of is like one of these, QAnon conspiracy sort of threads or Reddit threads or things that, where you will find some of these, wacky things going on, but the people who are reading them believe it because it makes sense to them, right? It explains why things, why they're so upset about what is going on. So yeah, I hadn't really thought about it that way until you asked the question, but it is, it does raise some sort of similarities between those things that we're concerned about with, sort of unregulated social media today, as well as what is, what's going on in the 1870s.
Now, Chris and Tracy, I can't see you just in case you do want to ask a question. And if you don't, that's fine. But if you either want to put your video on, or if you don't want to do that, please put something in the chat and I'd be happy to call upon you. Lyndall or Jared, I don't know if either of you would like to ask a question. I don't mean to call upon you, but I just have. Jared?
Yeah, I guess I'll ask a very selfish question, which is that I was most taken with the sort of reconstruction of African American sort of freedmen's emotional worlds, especially in the sort of first 3 chapters. And I was wondering if you could describe more the research process behind getting at some of those cultural and intellectual facets.
Yeah, and that's actually, that topic is something that's really the focus of the book that I'm just finishing up now. Is sort of an emotional history of emancipation and what was it like. One of the main group of sources I'm using for this new book are the Federal Writers Project ex-slave narratives. And one of the questions that's on their questionnaire that they often ask, is what did it feel like to be free? Right? And so that has been my research question while I've been writing this book, is what did it feel like to be free? And there are I found some really great answers to that, and I'm happy to talk more about that project. But going back to the first one, I mean, I was really interested in what did it feel like, right, to be living in this moment and to be living in a place and a time where you couldn't, sort of, what could you, where there is very limited, sort of state enforcement in terms of law enforcement. You couldn't, count on anyone protecting you. And if you tried to protect yourself, that didn't always go so well either. So I was interested in sort of this emotional transformation that had to accompany, the political and the legal and the social transformation that was going on as well. And so one of the bodies of sources really that I was first using when I started the project were letters to Southern governors. My dissertation advisor was Stephen Hahn, and he was actually finishing up A Nation Under Our Feet, which and he just had in his house boxes and boxes and boxes of photocopies of letters to Southern governors. And so he would, to all his, students, he would just like, here, and he'd give you a box of letters, and we would toddle off to our library, Carol, and, here's Mississippi, here's he has all this stuff. So that's how I sort of got started. We're reading these letters that freed people were writing, or maybe they were, using the local Freedmen's Bureau agent or a minister or somebody to write the letter for them. And they were writing to these Southern governors in the late 1860s, asking for things. And so, one of the things that becomes noticeable, very, very shortly is that they're asking for protection. They're asking for soldiers to come and protect them, right? Because their little community, or they're under threat, or they're asking for guns. So they were asking for guns or ammunition. They said, if you can't send the soldiers, we understand, just send us some guns, we'll do it ourselves. So they were really, interested and felt that, this absence, right, this void of sort of state protection, and they were willing to try to figure out how to fill that void. And some of the, the biggest quote unquote Reconstruction riots that you have are often over guns. The big one in New Orleans in 1874 was over a shipment of guns that this Crescent City White League had procured, and that the Republican governor's militia, or the city of New Orleans police, which was actually a branch of the state militia working for the Republican governor, and who was led by none other than former Confederate General James Longstreet, the scallywag, intercepted the shipment. And that was where this great Battle of New Orleans in 1874 between the White League and the Metropolitan Police happened. And that often gets left out of the story. So that's where I sort of started, were these letters from freed people asking the state for protection, asking the state for guns, and then trying to follow out sort of this, these attempts to either arm freed people, and where that went wrong, like the Camilla riot in Georgia in 1868, or attempts to sort of disarm white people, like New Orleans in 1874, as well.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well,
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, because I know there's some graduate students, I'm happy to talk sort of process as well, because this was my sort of dissertation to book. I don't know that I have any particular thing, sort of things you should do, but I can tell you some things not to do. I would, my first piece of advice would be don't have a study that's about the entire South, which I thought was a great idea at the time. And everyone's like, aren't you going to just narrow that down, focus on a state? And I was like, no, I'm all over the place. That was really hard in the end. I wish if I could go back, I would sort of redefine the scope of my project a bit, I think.
So I have to leave in a couple minutes, sure. But I wanted to go ahead and ask my questions so I could see the answers on the recording later. And one of the questions is, I think, very much in line with what you were just talking about. You mentioned that you were working on your dissertation proposal right around 9/11. So I guess, so I was just talking with someone the other day and told them that my dissertation, I believe, is going to be very much an autobiography. And I think most scholarship is an autobiography in some way, or at least our attempts to understand our own times. But I guess before I have to hop off, I just wanted to ask how you kind of, how do you suggest, or how did you kind of navigate these personal ideas with the scholarly historical, and kind of mesh them together in a way that, I guess, because there's always the risk of kind of weakening your credibility, but also I think in a way strengthening your credibility when you are kind of talking about it from a personal perspective. And then also I wanted to throw in another question, which we can answer or not, is I guess this the idea of counter-revolution of property, and kind of how that played into the kinds of stories of these rumors and these fears that white Southerners had about violence. I mean, you mentioned Han and his kind of the Christmas insurrection scare and stuff like that. So I'm really upset that I have to leave now, but I look forward to seeing the answers a little later. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, in terms of sort of, autobiography, I think it's important that we all as scholars recognize and reflect on our own personal relationships to our topics, right? Everybody chooses a topic that's in some ways sort of personally appealing to them. You may not always understand exactly why, but I think it's important for us, excuse me, to reflect on that and be honest about it. But you're right. I think, you don't want to end up, producing a piece of work that's really just navel gazing, right? Or so idiosyncratic that, no one else, you don't care about, making the case for its importance to anyone else. So it is a balancing act. And of course, there could be things that you're too close to write about. The whole sort of objectivity question. No one is completely objective or ever can be, but you do want to have, I think, some kind of, if you're writing a a book that's purely scholarly, and I'm going to presume everybody's dissertation does sort of have to toe that line, that you do have enough sort of scholarly distance from something to be able to analyze it and write about it, with some perspective. Otherwise, it becomes more memoir, which, is okay. But, when you're in your dissertation phase, you are trying to sort of prove your scholarly credentials. And, your dissertation advisor and your committee most likely have certain kinds of expectations of that project and what they want it to be. The beauty of getting further along in your career like I am is you have a little more freedom. And so something I'm imagining for my next book, which would be my third one, is more of a sort of history stroke memoir, histoire, where I'm going to return to my hometown in Kentucky, where in 1908 there was a mass lynching for men. You've probably, if you've seen the Without Sanctuary exhibit, you've probably seen the postcard that was made from it. And it was actually the postcard that actually stopped. There was a suit about it that actually made it illegal to send those images in the mail any longer. And it's something that's it's one of those pieces of local history that I grew up never knowing about. And it was only when I was in graduate school and I went to see the Without Sanctuary exhibit at the Chicago Historical Society and saw the photograph in my hometown written underneath that I was sort of floored and like, wait, I lived in this place for 18 years and I've never heard about this once. So I'm going to tackle that for my next project. But still, it's, thinking about our own personal connections to events and to sources is something that I think we all have to work around and struggle with. And it is a little tricky and a little dicey when you're trying to do that in your dissertation. So I guess my advice would be, if that's what's unfolding for you, then be upfront about it. Talk about it, deal with it, work it out with your dissertation advisor. But I guess, if I was advising a student, I'd say, be wary. If you're thinking about going with a topic that you do have some personal connection to in some way, I might advise at the dissertation phase to sort of think twice about it. I'm not saying don't do it, but, talk it out, think it out, read some works where people have done that kind of thing, and think about how you can do it, but still sort of, demonstrate, as he said, sort of your scholarly credentials to be able to, to talk authoritatively about something.
Carole, thank you. You've been very kind with your time.
Oh,
We've
thank
been
you.
here for 50 minutes. It's flown by now. I've learned a lot from listening to you. I have one last question for
Okay.
sure. I'm sure somebody better qualified than I might have a question. If any of you do would like to ask one last one before we wrap up, please let me know now. No? Okay. Well, really what I was going to ask you was just to talk a little bit about your next book, if you didn't mind. This book is coming out. I loved your idea about the sensation of liberty, and the question of what it feels like to be free, which is a question that perhaps in the 20th century was answered through music and through literature, as it was through the kind of testimony you're seeing in documents. So I just wondered, as a way of finishing up, and I'd like to thank you at the end from everybody after you speak, but just to see us out a little bit with your reflections and the work that you've been doing just recently, please.
Sure. Yeah. So as I said, my upcoming book, which it really looks at the ex-slave narratives, which I looked at a little bit in the first book. You'll notice, I think it's chapter 3. I sort of, when I'm unearthing sort of some of these reactions to this redemptive notion of freedom amongst ex-slaves, that's where I got sort of started on it. And I wanted to follow them up because there anybody who's ever read those or started looking through them, they're just so rich and they're so evocative and there are so many stories. And so one of the things, I sort of argue in this book is that when emancipation happened during the Civil War, there were approximately 4.5 million enslaved people in the United States. And emancipation happened at least 4.5 million times, right? Emancipation was a very individualized process, and it meant and it felt differently for different people. So I can just give you some of the examples I deal with in the book. So there's one woman, her name is escaping me at the moment. And one of the questions that interviewers will often ask is, what were you doing? Do you remember the moment you learned you were free? And she says, absolutely. It was a Tuesday at 10 o'clock in the morning. And they're like, how do you remember that? It was like 80 years ago. And she said, I remember because I was scrubbing the kitchen floor, and I always scrubbed the kitchen floor on Tuesday morning. And the master came in and he called everybody outside and he read the freedom papers. That's what they refer to as the Emancipation Proclamation, or just the notification, right? That probably the war is over, right? We've lost, it's done. And he told everybody they were free. And then he said, you can stay on if you want, or you can go, or you can do whatever you want to. I don't care. And so the interviewer says, well, what did you do? And she said, well, I finished scrubbing the kitchen floor. Right? Because it was, what did it mean? She's out on this farm in the middle. It was a very remote, I think it might have even been like southwestern Georgia. It's this area where it's just like, nothing in her immediate world had changed, and the news, they had not sunk in. It didn't have any sort of flesh, any kind of real resonance for her. And so one of the things that I noticed in these interviews is that it takes a while. Sometimes it's a few days, a few weeks, sometimes it's years, right? To kind of wrap their mind around, I'm free. It's no more. And so you'll have other people who said, I couldn't, someone told her, this is a different woman, they told her, you should stop calling, the people who used to own you master and mistress. And she said, I just couldn't, because that's who they were, right? This was who they were. And another woman who was in Texas, you know, she had been refugee to Texas, right? So she had been living out east somewhere, and her owners had trekked her all the way to Texas to try to escape the Union Army. And so she lived, you know, somewhere, again, kind of remote. And she was the only enslaved person left on the place. And I think she'd been a small child, and, you know, she was a teenager now after the war. And she had no people, right? She had no family. She didn't know what to do. And she knew some freed people from, you know, the neighboring place. And they said, you know what, you should go to Dallas, or I think it was Bonham, Texas. You should go to town. It's about 10 miles away. There are jobs there. It's a lot better. They'll treat you better. You can earn some money. You know, you can do what you want. And she just said, you know, for weeks, she would walk to sort of the end of the property line, the end of the fence, and she would just stand and look off into the distance toward town. Of course, there are no lights, right? Before lights, but she would just stand there and look off into the distance and sort of think about going. And it took her weeks and weeks and weeks. And even then, you know, she packed up her stuff and she left in the middle of the night because she was afraid, right? Her owners were going to come after her, try to stop her, that she wouldn't have the courage to do it. So this is a, you know, a really sort of fraught, you know, process for a lot of people. Not everyone. There are people who, you know, the moment that they know they're free, they, you know, throw down their hoe and they're off, right? They've been planning this for years. And it's finally happened, and they know exactly what they're going to do. But a lot of people, you know, don't. And it has a lot to do with their age. Of course, the people who are being interviewed in the 1930s, some of them were very young children or teenagers. A couple who were incredibly old were in their 20s, you know, at the time emancipation happened. So they're young. A lot of them are dependent on other people. But they also, you know, they talk about their parents' reactions or their grandparents' reactions. And there are a lot of mixed emotions. I mean, people are happy to be free. They've been praying for it forever. But it's also, you know, a really confusing, scary, sad time, because, you know, now you've got to find a place to live in many circumstances. You want to go somewhere else, but you don't know what to do. You don't have any money. You don't have any transportation. So there's just a lot of things, you know, in that moment, in those weeks and months after emancipation, that you have to work out to try to, you know, imagine what your life is going to be like. And so that's what the second book's about.
Well, Carole, congratulate you, and I look forward to reading it.
Thank you. Thank you.
I wanted to thank you all for being here today. I want to thank Stephen again for the opportunity for us all to speak with Carole. And I want to wish all of you doing your graduate research the very best of luck. I know these are very difficult times to conduct such work, and if I can ever help you, please let me know. And if I can, I will certainly do so. But thank you for being part of this community here today. Thank you for taking us so sensitively through such complicated and difficult territory. And thank you also for showing us that there's always a light ahead of us. Maybe you could all unmute yourselves and we will give Carole a little round of applause. But thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Carole.
Thanks.
This was great.
Thank
Take
you.
care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Hey,
Hope
Carole.
to see you all again soon in person somewhere.